computer.
There you go.
Yeah, okay. So really what I wanted to just so the video these videos are, like I said, they're very technical, but the big brush kind of like, overarching, themes of, how did the Fed's policy evolve into what it is today, and where did we get at today? That's really what I wanted people to get out of this. Um, the key thing about the history, is I think I mean, first off, I think it's real insightful just to understand how we got to where we are today, and coming out, so following it all the way from, the post-war era, and we had that period of hyperinflation, and called the Great Inflation. Actually, it's not really hyperinflation. That was spoken wrong. It's a great inflation. Hyperinflation, you can get up into the millions, okay, of percentages. So what it costs the dollar for milk might cost $1 million for milk next year. That's just crazy. But that actually has happened in many different countries around the world, and that's not exactly what we're talking about. But there was quite a period of hyperinflation. Not hyper. See, I keep saying that hyperinflation. A large amount of inflation, the Great Inflation. Um, so what I did here is I just plotted from the Fred. Let's see if I can hide this part. So I've got three different plots here. The blue is M2. That's money supply. And I'm not sure, did y'all, from first principles, the money supply can be measured in a couple ways. You've got M1, M2. Those are the two very common ones. M2 is a little bit, just think about liquid or less liquid. M2 is a little bit less liquid, includes savings and other things like this. But it's a very much widespread use, or just a widespread measure of the money supply. I put that in because, I mean, if you look at the M2, this graph made me almost fall off my chair when I first saw it, when I first started teaching principles, because you just notice, I mean, like, look at that spike. Do you see that right there in the blue line?
Yep.
It breaks all historical records. I mean, the money supply was extremely consistent throughout time, and the stability of the US dollar is why, so many countries hold US dollars, um, to balance their own currencies and things. And so, when I saw the spike, it was very concerning to me, because first off, I knew inflation was coming. So I mean, I saw the spike right about, right shortly after it happened, and I thought, okay, we definitely have to have inflation. Just think of supply, demand of money. You've got you bump the supply out really high, the value of money has to fall. You have to have inflation. It's baked in the pie at that point. There's no escaping it. I knew it was coming. If you look back at the news was still very optimistic and rosy. They were thinking that we were going to have a 2% inflation. It was, oh, and the Fed started to manage this. So they really do manage expectations in the marketplace. And you started hearing, okay, so as you know, that after the history, the target for inflation is 2%. And the Fed's really trying to balance inflation and unemployment. They've got a dual man. That's the dual mandate. It's the inflation and unemployment sort of trade off there. And so they started saying, well, we're going to target 2%, but target it from above, meaning that they're going to allow it to go above and then try to bring it down. That was a big. So that might sound small to a lot of people, but that was like, I was thinking, whoa, this is a major policy. This is a major shift. Obviously, there's a lot of money in the economy that just got dumped in there, and yeah, they're trying to. I could see what they were kind of doing, but yet, like, Wall Street was still thinking that that the COVID, pandemic sort of was going to be, the recovery was going to be this quick recovery, and no one was thinking about inflation. Interest rates were still very low. So if you look at the green is the 30-year fixed mortgage rate, and you can see that after the jump, the interest rates remained low all the way up. They only started rising, what is that, about October of 21? But this printing happened in March through May of 2020. So quite a while before. So the thing I really like about this part of the graph over here is actually showing it really demonstrates the lag that happens between, so a couple lags between money printing and how that actually translates to prices. It's not instantaneous. There's a lag, and you can see that the jump in money, and the green is actually, oh, sorry, the red is the CPI. That's a percentage change year over year. If you look at it real carefully, you can, I'm trying to line up with that spike in the M2. You can see that the red didn't start to really jump until later. And then the policy response was actually a little bit delayed too. So that kind of follows. And if we look back in the 70s, when we started to have inflation, you can kind of see too that, I mean, the policy response is going to be, so interest rates, the Fed responded to inflation in the 70s by really jacking up rates. And again, that was kind of lagged. And you can also notice that it kind of peaks off after. So interest rates really started to fall well after the inflation rate had started to fall, which I think is kind of, and we see that here too in the current period. We see, that the red line, the CPI starts falling, but yet the Fed still is increasing the interest rates, which also translate to the 30-year mortgage. So this is very similar patterns actually between the 70s and the current period. I think all those different, just the key thing I take away from that is just the lag between printing money and then transmission to actual prices, and then also the lag between prices changes and policy sort of reactions to those. Or there's two different types of sort of patterns that I think are very informative. That was very interesting. So before the 70s, and I think you might have gotten this from the video, they were targeting, they didn't have the dual mandate. They were just focused on unemployment. And they were stoking the economy because they came out of that post-war period, and everyone was just, unemployment was crazy during the Depression and after the war. Everyone still had those kind of fears of mass unemployment. And so they were actually overstoked the economy, leading to that inflationary period. And then post the Great Inflation, you get the dual mandate where they say, okay, we have to both look at unemployment and also inflation. And then that became so they start targeting the 2% afterwards, and that kind of led us to where we're at, where we got today. Key thing that you can kind of also see. Let's see if we can see anything else. Can you see any other patterns here? I'm just trying to look if I missed anything really. I mean, you can definitely see that, the bars are recessionary periods, and the Fed actually does respond by dropping rates typically during recessionary periods to try to stoke up the economy. So like, how does that work? Do you know how that works, by the way, Jason? I'm not sure if that's clear about how interest rates translate to the real economy. But they typically translate through the investment channel. So investment, and when I'm talking about investment, I'm not talking about stock markets. I'm really talking about real investment, which is the creation of capital. Capital is going to be buildings. Okay, it's going to be machines, vehicles, furnitures. It's actual investment into a production process, and capital is the thing that actually sticks around in the production process. Unlike intermediate goods, unlike labor that gets spent in the production, it's actually, the machine stays there overnight. It's the thing that sticks. And investment in this context is actually the measurement of, creating new capital, making new buildings. So why, you can really see that, why does lowering rates maybe spur on investment? Well, obviously it becomes cheaper to borrow, right? And so projects that, so if you took finance, you look at like net present value of a project or something, and you can actually you're using rates to sort of discount cash flows. And, you also have basically, just in summary, to make it very simple, lower rates mean that you can take loans for projects and actually be more profitable, right? But when rates are high, projects that might be profitable under lower rates aren't really profitable, so you don't take those ventures. So higher rates obviously depress real investments into capital creation. Lower rates spur it, and so it's been one of the vehicles for policy that they're really trying to target there. I want to show you just a quick thing. Did you know? So Janet Yellen is somebody. She's a very sweet lady. Okay, you'd be very surprised. She looks like a bulldog when you see her on the news. Okay, but she's somebody that you can really follow because she has a very big hand in policies. You know, she's the Treasury Secretary, the current Treasury Secretary. I had the honor of actually meeting her and talking with her at dinner in San Diego. And like I said, you'd be really surprised. You would never guess that she was such a bulldog when it comes to the economy, because she was just sitting there very quietly, just kind of eating with her husband, who's a Nobel Prize laureate, Ekolov. But they're just very quietly, kind of an older couple eating dinner and very quietly, and you just like, wow, okay, you just don't guess. But you know, she's actually got, I think, her hand on the heartbeat of the economy. So that's somebody I would probably just follow as far as like looking into the future about what might be coming and how things are unfolding. She's got a lot of insight on that.
Okay.
I did want to look. Let's see here. We have that graph. I already looked at that. Did you know about yield curves at all?
No.
So interestingly, a yield curve might be a little much to go about. Like, I don't have a way to draw this here, but generally you can imagine that in normal times you would think that longer term types of borrowing would actually have higher rates than short term borrowing. There's more uncertainty in the, you know, you think, okay, well, interest rates might rise, there's uncertainty, you look forward. So that's under normal times, but there's oftentimes the market starts to anticipate that we're coming into a slowdown, anticipate that what's going to happen in a slowdown. Well, the Fed's probably going to cut interest rates, right? So there's expectations about the future, and those expectations actually get sort of baked in to current yields. And so what happens is when you, a lot of times in the past, so when markets sort of expect cuts to be coming in the future, right? Then what you get is you actually get longer term rates that are lower than the short term rates. So typically, if you think of like the duration of the maturity on the x-axis, right, and then the yield on the y-axis, that's typically slope positive because longer rates typically higher return or higher interest rates, right? But when they have this sort of expectation of cuts, that yield curve goes negative or flat or negative. And so how you can measure that, it's here on the Fred. It's that you can just type in yield curve if you ever want to look at it and search for it. But it's good. There's a lot of different measures. This is the 10-year constant maturity minus the 3-year. So 10-year, you expect to have more higher rates than the 3-month, sorry, 3-month, not 3-year. You'd expect the 10-year to have higher yield or higher rates than the 3-month, right? But when the market has these expectations of future rate cuts, the 3-month rate actually starts to become bigger than the longer term outlook drops, and what you end up with is negative values. So this is 0 on the axes, and you end up with these negative values. And one of the interesting things you might know is look at these recessions. I mean, we've had negative yield curves before each recession, going back like quite a ways actually. So, and if you look now, I mean, look at this yield curve. This is crazy. I mean, clearly there's a lot of expectations right now. What this tells me is there's a lot of expectations about future rate cuts coming down the pipeline. And in fact, you can see that in the news. You know, you don't even need a yield curve to tell you that. You know, I think this is definitely something that I would look at. I mean, you can even see it dipped. This is actually a very interesting finding I found here. Look at this. This is the COVID recession, or I'm going to call it the pandemic recession. But there was actually an inverted yield curve before we ever knew COVID was a thing. I mean, isn't that interesting? I think that's incredibly interesting. And in fact, I could show you something else that I think is super interesting. I'll just show you this.
So with that having a negative yield turn in the current state that it's in, does that worry you about the upcoming year or so, or?
Yeah, there's signs actually. there's a couple signs. These are called telltales. They're you know what telltale is? It's actually also it's a sailing term. When you sail, your sails are filled with the wind, and you want to sort of trim or pull your ropes to make your sails have efficient wind to make it efficient. But the problem is you can't see the wind. So what the sailors do is they tie strings on the sail, and then you can see how the strings blow. So those are called telltales. You can't see the wind, but you can see how the string blows. And this is one of the telltales for the economy is the yield curve, and there's a couple other ones. Another one is actually looking at real investment. Real investment, I'll just put it up here real quick. And I think we need to put it on, I'll put it on the other axes so that we don't, because the yield curve we're in the billions and the yield curve's in percentages, so we'll go like that. So the red is actually investment. And actually, very interestingly, you look back in time, and you can see that investments typically start to dive before these recessions. And this kind of goes in line with the book, that manias, panics, crashes, right? There's optimism and then there's pessimism setting in. So this is very much in line. And you can see before all of these, they definitely dips during recessions, but even before, you'll see, the red line, if you look after this is the 2021.com bust. You see that, the investment started to tail off before the actual, and you see an inverted yield curve. So you see inverted yield curves, you see investment dropping. Those are two telltales of recessions to come. We saw that before the 2008. There was a lot of investment starts to drop, yield curves negative. We get a 2008 recession. Interestingly enough, if you look at this COVID-19 pandemic, investment is also starting to drop and the yield curve was negative, which I thought was really fascinating because a lot of times, a lot of people, and I think this is kind of an untold story, is that a lot of people think that the recession that we had was just purely from COVID-19, but in fact, investment was dropping. If you look at the dates real closely, this is November of 19. That's before we ever knew COVID existed. So, I mean, it's kind of hard, it's kind of hard just to dismiss that recession as being purely COVID driven. It's almost like we were heading into a recession and then we got smacked with COVID on top of it. That's kind of how I see it. When we look at investment actually was kind of starting to, so when I was back here at this time period in June of 22, I was looking at this, and actually more like November of 22, you could see negative yield curves. And if you're standing at this point in time, investments also are dropping. And, so that made me, at this point in time, I was thinking, yeah, this doesn't look good. Of course, the difficult thing after post-COVID is the world's changed. And so, and you saw the money supply issue, and we've gotten into a really crazy world. We've really broken away from, sort of a lot of the different fundamentals that were existing pre-2008. So the big shifts that happened actually were in 2008, the world changed. The way the economy actually worked changed. The way monetary policy worked changed. So it was actually they started doing QE, quantitative easing. And I'm blanking on the acronym for, these large asset purchases that the Fed does. I'm forgetting the acronym that they use. But the Fed basically started buying up troubled securities in 2008. So what they were doing is they started buying up all of the, these real estate portfolios from the banks that were troubled, taking them off their books. And that was really unprecedented because before then, all the policy tools were, actually manipulating interest rates, manipulating also the reserve requirement ratios. Are you familiar with those? Reserve requirement ratios. And that's actually another interesting graph. I should just look at that real quick. I'm just going to go Fred and look at this. This is another interesting graph just to show you how the world changed. If we look at reserves,
So
bank.
one of those things that you were talking about, how banks were struggling at that time because of their depreciated assets and properties and stuff. So my cousin's in real estate, and around that time when those type of actions were occurring, he was actually getting calls from banks wanting to sell off those properties and try to regain some of the values at that time to
Oh
put
yeah,
them in a better place.
yeah. I had friends working in that industry, and they were buying up stuff like crazy.
Hmm.
But this graph is also really telling. So reserves, so banks, they were required to keep 10% of their deposits in reserve. Um, because we have a fractional reserve banking system. So like all the money that you put in is in the bank. They just keep a fraction of it, and they're supposed to lend the rest out. And so prior to 2008, it looks like it's zero, but it's actually not. It's just really low. What this is telling you is that banks were lending out like all the money that they really could up to their reserve requirements, or getting really close. I mean, because they don't want to dip down. If they dip down, then they have to go borrow in the
Hmm.
overnight market to make their balance sheets work. Um, but so then they have to pay interest on it. So they're really trying to keep it close to the minimum that they could, which means that they were extending loans as much as they could. And we see post 2008 the reserves just take off, and actually now we don't even have reserve ratios because there's so many reserves in the system. What this is kind of telling you is that banks, like, fundamentally are like they're not putting all of these available funds into loans in the marketplace post 2008. That's one of the ways the world changed. Um, the economy really did go through some transitions in here, besides just so that shift in buying up these assets, and the shifts in Fed policy. They've had dramatic impacts on the banking system and just on how banking's worked historically. So that's been a big change. We see again, like, reserves piling up. I mean, they printed all that money and it just piled up in reserve. A lot of it piled up in reserve. So that's one of the things. One of the reasons I think why we didn't see just immediate inflation, because actually, if you think about it, if you printed however much money, it doesn't matter how much. I mean, it could be like, hundreds of trillions of dollars. That doesn't really matter anything if all you did was pile that money into a vault. It becomes inflationary when all that money starts flying around the economy and making transactions. Then there's more money per
Hmm.
goods. And so what's interesting is when you see inflation kick in, it's actually when those reserves started to finally dip. That was interesting. So when reserves started to finally dip, if you remember, and like, we could actually put inflation up there again. It's kind of weird when I look at the graph of inflation, because the graph here, it looks like it took off, but we didn't really notice it in consumer prices until I think about January of 22. January 22 is when we started to actually see when it started to become, when the Fed made, some more. Those were when more of the dramatic policy shifts started, actually, when their messaging was, okay, we're going to target it from above. Okay, yeah, we've got inflation. It's going to be short term. They kept on managing this, but the inflation expectation really started to happen when those reserves started dropping. And we see inflation take off right about then too. So as far as the consumer inflation, which on the data, it's kind of weird, because on the data, I could put it up here. It actually shows. It actually shows, like, if I go CPI, if you want to see how to do CPI, all items, I'll just do all items. I'll add the series and I'll put it on the right. And then I'll go to edit this line. And this is the CPI. So the CPI is just a measure of the consumer price index. And to calculate inflation, we don't want to just have the index. We want the percentage change from a year ago. That's actually a more stout way of doing it. Right here, you notice that it looks like inflation's really taken off. What was this, March of 21? But like in March of 21, no, if you look back, nobody had that inflation actually on their radar as something that was serious. and we all didn't really feel it in our pocketbook. So like it just kind of dumbfounds me how this data set works a little bit, because it's a little bit contrary to my experience. Just when I was looking, because I'm looking at the data, I'm looking at the news, but I don't know. I'm not in it deep enough to really have insight beyond that. Which you know,
I mean,
I'm not a monetary economist. My economics was more in trade and other things. Okay, because um,
do you think that part of the change of spending habits in the economy was based on a cultural shift that occurred during the pandemic?
a cultural shift. What do you mean? Like what kind of cultural shift?
So just like different mentalities, different spending habits, people change their life patterns.
Yeah, there's some things that really did change. I mean, you can look at the employment markets, and you see some shifts in, like, there are some dramatic things that like happen that just, it's like the world changed. You can see it a little bit as far as like a cultural change. Probably, definitely. I think you see that in commercial retail, right? You know, people got so used to buying things online from Amazon and these other online retailers, and the brick and mortar shops, they really took a beating. Um, Now, the thing that kind of amazed me is like just how it seemed like the commercial real estate rental prices had remained fairly sticky on the high end, like in the pre-pandemic. And I hadn't followed it, but I just thought to myself, wow, that really looks overvalued. You know, like how could you possibly make it in a brick and mortar place? And we started seeing, you know, if you saw all the empty shops and the boarded up places, it just seems like it's pervasive, and it hasn't yet. I don't know. I haven't really looked at commercial real estate prices, but I just would be shocked if they can stay where they're pegged. And I'm not sure how or what's driving that kind of stickiness, but
Yeah, I
it
mean,
just,
half of our office building is empty at this point because we still have it at least 50% remote. And what they're doing is starting to, sublease certain sections of other companies that work within the hospital system and stuff like that just to help cover that cost.
yeah, and I just don't understand why prices haven't fallen. Because I mean, maybe they have, and maybe I'm not aware of it, but um, I haven't really looked at the data recently. And then I'm pulling back from like a year and a half or 2 years ago, even um, since I looked at it. But it was kind of shocking to me even then. I was like, wow. I mean, I see vacancies, I see all this extra surplus, but yet it seems like prices are high. And how could you make it if you're a brick and mortar and you have to pay those kind of prices? It just, so yeah, as far as culture changes, that's one I saw, and that's one I'm still kind of baffled as far as how that's going to pan out. I don't have a great insight there, but I'd imagine commercial real estate might be overvalued. Maybe. And how and why isn't it correcting? That's kind of an interesting question. I don't have enough industry insight to give a clear answer on it, but
Well, I
um,
mean, we've also had some discussions in the news where, companies are starting to bring people back on site and stuff
mhm.
like that. So maybe we're just tottering on the fence a little bit, still a little longer than normal.
Yeah, I mean it's a totally new world. I mean, you saw that money supply jump, and you know, and there's also been a de-dollarization, and that's been something of concern to me. So like when you realize that the dollar is being held abroad to balance because it's very stable, when you saw that big jump, my immediate concern was that, you know, there's more dollars actually off our shores than are on our shores. And so if they start dumping those dollars, I mean, that's a huge potential sort of pool for inflation also. You know, I mean, dump the dollar and then you end up with surplus of dollars and you end up back in this situation. And the other thing we have going is we have a huge national debt, which is just completely out of whack, and we cannot keep it going the way we are. So those are things that, I mean, it's really like we could end up in a debt crisis, and I think all it would take was maybe some politicians just bickering and about, you know, government shutdowns, which could end up actually having us degraded as our credits. Actually, if you look at our credit, we were AAA, and every single one of those kind of standoffs, or not everyone, but several of those, all of our all of our credit downgrades have happened as a result of those standoffs, and further downgrades could jack up interest rates, making cost of borrowing more expensive. And the government, surprisingly or not, when the interest rates were low, it seemed like anybody would just like automatically start to put positions in long run interest rates when you have low interest rates and you're a borrower, but they still have like a very substantial position in short term rates. And so, they have to keep issuing new bonds and rolling those over to keep it going. So it's like, okay, if rates go up, I don't know how, I mean, that could spur a debt crisis in itself. I mean, we're in a precarious kind of situation there. So I know there's a lot of talk in this election years about economies and about what's good, bad, and other. I've been terribly concerned, and I just hope that we can. I hope that we can. What's going to have to happen is we're going to have to make actually fiscal cuts and have some austerity to get us back into a more balanced economy. But that's never politically great. I mean, who's going to say, "Hey, guess what? I'm going to cut spending, throw us into a recession, cut all your favorite plans, and vote for me." By the way, and it's going to be
Well,
hard.
and the other difficult thing about it is that it only lasts 2 years of the presidency until the next person comes in and changes it
That's
all
it.
up again. So
That's
there's no stability to it.
that's it. These politicians, yeah, if they spend, it's sort of like burning paper on a fire. It makes the fire go, and then you end up, and it's like poof. But then they're like, okay, well, I've had my, and you see these in election years. I mean, so that big spike and I mean, of course, we had a pandemic, but that was also an election year, and you see, student loan forgiveness or other types of like charitable outgivings in these time periods, and it's oh man, I really do. It keeps me up sometimes. I'll be honest. So I don't know. It's we're at a place of such uncertainty. I mean, if I were to go back post 2008 or even after 2008, I felt like I could have more of a grasp on what was around the corner. And I feel like now, man, there's some like there's some big elephants in the room. And like, I just, it's hard to tell. It's really hard to look forward and have a clear, solid, okay, I feel good about this prediction now. Yeah.
I'm still in survival mode.
Yeah. Well, I think we're coming up towards the end of our
Yeah, 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay. Yeah, is there anything else you want to chat about or anything about
No,
this?
sir. No, sir. I'm good. I just hop on to participate and pick up what I can.
No, well, it's been great having you. And I know we're coming up to the last week. So that's do you feel like how do you feel like things are with the macro side of things? Do you feel like those videos, I know they're long and but do you feel like, I mean, I feel like they're very authoritative. I mean, they're coming from Ben Bernanke as the chairman of the Federal Reserve back then.
Yeah, I
So
mean, I found it helpful to more or less see how it was broken down by clips and then reviewing the slideshow and stuff like that. That helped keep up with the pace of it. But I mean, there's definitely some, from the macro side and the micro side, stuff that we've learned that we can apply to whichever type of career you're in or, personal finance and so on and so forth. And there's definitely been things that I should be able to apply.
no, that's great. That's awesome to hear. Um, I tried to make it real more just hands-on applicable. Um, so I mean, this is the topics we're in macro. These are sort of my, if I was to look at just the macroeconomy and try to think about how I could frame it, that's how I tried to. Of course, there's a lot of different ways you can look at the macroeconomy. So, but
No, I
anyway,
appreciate it. I've enjoyed it.
that's very good, Jason. Definitely. We're coming up, I know, to the last week, but if even afterwards, if you ever want to just stay in touch or whatever I can do for you, just please. I have students that I talked to from 8 years ago in different places that,
Okay.
um, so I'm definitely happy to be in contact, be a reference, be whatever I can be of help. So
No, I appreciate that.
so All right. Well, I'll let you go, I guess, before we get cut off at an awkward period.
Well, I hope your family feels better. Hope everybody gets back to where they need to be.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. And I'll just end the recording.
All right. Have a good evening.
Okay. Okay. You too. Take care.